This week on the WriterCon podcast.
Well, the first piece of advice I'd say is if you can avoid doing it, I would do so.
Welcome to WriterCon, a gathering place for writers to share their knowledge about writing and the writing world. Your hosts are William Bernhardt, best-selling novelist and author of the Red Sneaker books on writing, and Lara Bernhardt, award-winning author of the Wantland Files book series.
Thank you, Jesse Ulrich. Hey there, writers. Thanks for joining us. Lara, good to see you again. Lara has raced back from the Greek festival just so she can be here today. How was the festival?
It was so fun. We had a great time. We had sampled delicious food made right there on site. We heard music. We saw some dancing. We toured beautiful church, got a little history lesson. It was fun, but I didn't want to miss the podcast. So came on back home.
You've been staying busy. I'm working on a new book, but it's way too soon for me to talk about that because I really don't have a fix on what I'm doing yet. It's a little early. Jesse, are you staying busy?
I am staying very busy. I keep getting more clients, which is great, except there's only a limited amount of time in my day. So Jesse's team is growing. So
relatable.
Nice. Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes. So.
Well, our interview today is with author and celebrity interviewer Glenn Plaskin. He's the author of numerous New York Times bestsellers, including a biography of Vladimir Horowitz and a beautiful book I highly recommend called Katie Up and Down the Hall. You'll hear him talk about that during the interview. He has profiled so many interview subjects, I don't even know where to begin. Meryl Streep, Paul Newman, Robert De Niro, Carol Burnett, Dolly Parton. Who am I forgetting, Lara?
Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes. And Katharine Hepburn.
Katharine
Hepburn. Yeah. Both Audrey and Katharine Hepburn.
Right. Yeah, his interviews have appeared in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, LA Times, million other places. He's a terrific guy and a fascinating storyteller. And I'm looking forward to talking to him. But first, the news. Our first story concerns Brandon Sanderson, who...
My guy.
What?
My boy.
Oh, right. I was
Brando
afraid
Sando.
I mispronounced his name or something. What was that?
No, he's just really excited.
I'm just excited.
Well, I picked this for you, Jesse.
Thank you.
He's still making waves in the publishing world. You may remember an earlier story when we talked about his Kickstarter, in which he raised over $40 million to publish several books that he's written. And with those funds, he's now started his own publishing. And I don't mean just technically owns one. He's like created a facility for publishing and distributing books near his home. He's got his own conference that he does every year. And that's where this new announcement, which shouldn't surprise us at all, came about. He's going to start his own bookstore.
Yes.
He's purchased land next to the former Evermore Park in Pleasant Grove, Utah, which is designated for a bookstore. He also revealed that Dragonsteel, that's what he's calling the whole area. It's Dragonsteel Plaza. That's a word that comes. That's his book series, right, Jesse?
No, it's like a reference to it. That's the name of his company that he made after the $40 million. And I think his conference is also called Dragonsteel. So,
but I thought it came from the books. No.
Yes. It's not a name of one of his books. It comes from one of his books.
Well, is it the name of the series? Because they're talking about the fifth. Whatever. It doesn't matter.
Listeners. I want you to know that I know the name of the book series is the Stormlight Chronicles.
Okay.
No, wait, the Stormlight Archives. Oh my God, Stormlight Archives, and the fifth book comes out in December.
Okay, and he had a pop-up store at the conference, right? But now he's going for a real bookstore.
Yeah.
So, Jesse, I probably don't really even need to ask this, but would you shop at the Sanderson bookstore?
1,000%.
Yeah, are they going to stock everybody's books or just zillions of copies of his, I don't know, Fives fantasy novel? How many has he got?
3, 6. He's got like 10 to 12 now in total. I imagine he's going to have other authors there, knowing just the way he likes to do things. I imagine he will sell other people's, and I have no doubt his publishing arm will probably start publishing other people too.
Well, and that's the next question for the bookstore. Given the way this guy rolls, could this be the first bookstore in a chain? Could we get a fantasy-focused national bookstore chain? Because I think a lot of people would welcome that. I know a lot of industry insiders watch this podcast, so I want to be very clear. Themed bookstores is a great idea. Like a science fiction only bookstore, 1,000%. Fantasy only, 1,000%. Love it. Right, and we're seeing a lot of romance-focused or romantasy-focused bookstores opening, but not so much with fantasy, so maybe this will fill a niche.
Why is there not a bookstore that feels like The Green Dragon and Hobbiton, where I can buy fantasy books? Why does that not exist?
Well, but do we think, is he thinking of expanding into the former Evermore Park? Do we think maybe there's going to be a transition? He'll have his bookstore there, and then maybe there will be he'll theme that park to his dragon.
Do we have a Sanderson
Steel
theme park?
Yeah, Sanderson theme park.
Oh, that would be incredible.
Was he thinking, forward thinking when he bought that land?
Yeah, I know he's been.
That's what I'm wondering.
Like he's written for video games. He's done sort of the cinematic side of storytelling. I think he would love to hire a team to make a themed theme
I'm
park
wondering
for his
if that
stories.
was a tactical land purchase.
I believe
We'll be watching.
If I remember this correctly, I think like he grew up in the area and used to go to that park, and so he's got like real nostalgic memories for it. And now he's rich, so just like the South Park guys, he's like redoing his childhood.
That's right. Okay, well, news story number 2 then is semi-related because it's about romantasy. Not so much fantasy, but romantasy, the combination of romance and fantasy, storming Hollywood. Specifically, Entangled is launching its own production company. Entangled, again, if you've listened to previous WriterCon podcasts, that's the publisher of a lot of different things in the fantasy and romantasy genre, but their big hit right now, of course, would be Rebecca Yarros's books, like The Fourth Wing, the first book in a new series, which I believe was the best-selling book of 2023, and it's doing even better this year. So their CEO and founder, Liz Pelletier, has partnered with Cheryl Clark to launch this new company called Premeditated Productions, which has a 3-year first-look TV and film deal with Amazon, which, of course, now calls its movie branch Amazon MGM Studios because they bought MGM. And, there have been other attempts to do things like that. I mean, they're not necessarily going to be limited to Rebecca Yarros. I know a lot of people, including our daughter Katie, who would love to see a series based on Sarah J. Maas's books. But other than fantasy books that have the phrase Lord of the Rings in them somewhere, we haven't seen so much of that at the movies, have we, Jesse? We've seen it on television, The Witcher, The Wheel of Time, and all those things, but not so much at the theaters. Why is that? Or am I wrong?
Yeah. No, I think fantasy stories are usually too long and too dense to be put into film. It's, The Lord of the Rings works because it's actually not that long of a fantasy series. It's 3 500-ish page books, where like Brandon Sanderson's books, of which there are 4 published ones, each one's at least 1,000 pages. Right. And you can't compressing that to a 2 to 2.5 hour movie. It's just going to cut out so much.
That would be so disappointing.
Yes.
What do you think, Lara? Are you on board to watch the Fourth Wing film, I assume, at this point?
Yeah, I'd give that a try. Yeah, I would. I think that could be that would be interesting. Is that the idea there? They're hoping to turn that into something with a direct connection.
Yes, I think they want to do several things, but since the Fourth Wing is flying high right now, that's, in fact, I think that deal was initiated before they even formed this company. That might be where they got the seed money. Who knows? But I think that's the idea. I read that book too, And there's a lot in it, but it's only, I'm going to guess, maybe 400 or so pages. It's not Lord of the Rings length. So
I
maybe
think it's a
movie.
little longer than that, but the second one definitely jumps by a lot.
Yes. Right. Okay. All right. Well, enough with the news. Let's move to Craft Corner. Our Craft Corner segment comes from John Myers, a screenwriter and longtime friend of WriterCon. John also, with his friend Emily Brooks, hosts the terrific podcast Write Better Together. And they've co-authored a book called, I love this, Write Anyway, Giving Yourself Permission to Write No Matter What. Today he's going to address nonfiction, although I think fiction writers may very well find it useful as he discusses the challenge of balancing authenticity and storytelling in nonfiction and memoir. John, take it away.
Craft Corner.
Welcome, everybody, to WriterCon's Craft Corner. I'm John Myers from Write Better Together. Hey, look, everybody, it's Emily Brooks.
Hello, John Myers.
How do you balance authenticity and storytelling in memoir?
The first thing that we do is we want to focus on the small moments. So William Zinsser says, look for small self-contained incidents that are still vivid in your memory. If you still remember them, it's because they contain a universal truth your readers will recognize from their own life.
Larry David talks about when you're packing a suitcase, right, and you're getting ready to go on a trip. It's a moment that everyone can relate to. Everyone's packed for a trip in anticipation of something.
And even if it's not completely universal, your emotions are going to be universal. If you remember those moments vividly, that means that there is something important about those moments where you learned something and grew in some way. The second thing we do is connecting with our reader emotionally through authenticity.
We just had on our podcast Renee Gutteridge from WriterCon. After all of these years, she still has a very specific emotion about when you hit send on a script or on a query. She's totally honest about it.
The third thing is, what can you fabricate?
In A Paper Orchestra by Michael Jamin, there's a story in there called Yellow Belt. As a child, Jamin would build these little structures out of twigs, and then some bullies came by and crushed them all. His dad's solution was to go to karate. Jamin passes the class. He's in the first version of the story. He ends it with sitting in the car and his dad's proud of him and he passed the class. That's true. But in this version that's actually in the book, it ends with Jamin going back home, building the structures again. And so that's a more compelling, more emotionally satisfying ending.
Being honest doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be accurate all the time. It may mean that you compress timelines or you move dialogue from one moment to another moment, that the emotional impact is true to that story.
Thank you so much, John. That was terrific. Now let's cut to this interview with celebrity interviewer and author Glenn Plaskin. Glenn Plaskin, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm honored because you're both such prolific authors yourselves. Wow.
Well, thank you. Okay, we have a traditional first question. If you could offer writers one piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, the first piece of advice I'd say is if you can avoid doing it, I would do so. If you've got, if you've got any other marketable talent, use it, because I don't think being a writer is a necessarily easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I view it not so much as an art, but as a business. But also, most of my projects have been tied to a passion of mine. So what I'm saying is if you feel passionate about it and you feel that you just must do it and you can't think of anything else to do, then, you know, but the chances of success in this world as a writer are difficult, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you added that last part, because I was, being an amateur ivory tickler myself, before we started this, I showed you my grand piano right to my left. So I was totally impressed to learn that you actually trained as a classical pianist, right?
Yes. In fact, my aspiration was never to be a writer. I have no training as a writer. I never went to college. I went to 9 years of college to become a concert pianist myself. And when I was around 25 or 26, I realized that I actually didn't want to do that. Performing made me extremely nervous. And so I was going to wind up being a teacher. Didn't want to do that either. So I had an idea for a book. I had never written a book. I had never even written a college paper. In music school, you don't write. And so I had this idea for a book. I wanted to write a book about the most famous pianist in the world. It had never been done, and it just came to my mind. So I came to New York, and I went to 15 publishers, and I got their interest, not because of me. I always tell people, you're not selling yourself, you're selling your idea. And then I went to the William Morris Agency, and I met with the chief agent, this guy who handled James Michener and all these, and President Nixon and all these people. And he said, well, what have you written? I said, nothing. He said, well, what have you had published? I was indignant. I said, nothing. He said, then what are you doing here? And I said, here's my idea. And I handed him a piece of paper. And on the paper were 15 publishers, including Jacqueline Onassis, who was an editor at Doubleday. So to make a long story short, he said, where's your book proposal? I didn't know what a book proposal was. So I don't know how I did it. To this day, I don't know how I did it. But I went and wrote a book proposal, came back, and he sold the book. And 3 years later, you can't see it here, but the book came out, and it was the first book ever written about this person. And so what I had basically done is take my passion and knowledge about music, and I had used it in another medium, which was writing a book.
Right.
And when the book was published, it was literally on the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and it was all over the world. And because no book had ever been written about him, and because it had a lot of information in it that had never been known. So suddenly I found myself, quote, an author, which I found very amusing because I never thought of myself that way. And then when the book was published, the agent said, well, you'd like to write another book? I said, no, I do not want to write another book. I had no interest in writing another book. I said, I want to interview celebrities because I had this weird talent talking to famous people and getting them to open up to me. So that's what I did for the next 10 years. The first one was Carol Burnett, then Elizabeth Taylor, then Calvin Klein, then Nancy Reagan, and on and on and on. And this turned out to be my real talent, which was writing magazine and newspaper profiles and a syndicated column that eventually came out of that. And the collection of my interviews was ultimately in another book that Oprah Winfrey did a whole show on. So if you ask somebody, well, could you have planned this out? Oh, yes, let's go to music school for 9 years, only to quit. You know what I mean? And then we'll write a book, even though you've never written one. Who would want you to write a book? And then after the book, we'll interview celebrities for 10 years. I don't think you could have ever gone to school to learn that. And honestly, my greatest talent was not writing, even though I was good. My greatest talent is, I believe, the greatest asset you have as a writer is your tenacity.
Right. I agree.
I think you have to be determined. I think in life you have to be determined about anything that you want to do. You have to focus. And so I was able to just drill down almost obsessively and focus on this. So it wasn't like I wanted to be a writer. That was never my dream. My dream was more based in fame. As a child, I used to sit at a newspaper stand and look at Life magazine. I liked looking at movie stars, and I liked looking at the First Lady and stuff. And so I never thought ever in my life that years later I would meet Jacqueline Onassis and have lunch with her, or I would meet Nancy Reagan at the White House twice, once after Reagan's assassination and attempt, and meet her. So what I'm trying to say is I'm a firm believer in visualization. I honestly believe that if you can do a dry rehearsal in your mind and run it over and over again, as I did, dreaming, literally dreaming of what you think you could make true, it's been proven that if you can visualize it, you have a much better chance of making it happen.
Sure.
I think that our younger generation calls that manifesting it into existence. Like you stay focused on something and believe in it long enough, and eventually it will actually come to pass. I
Hmm.
I'd like to talk some more about you did more than just meet Jacqueline Onassis, didn't you? I understand that you worked with her. And she was an editor at Doubleday.
Well, yes, when we first met, we were trying to talk Calvin Klein, the designer, into writing a book. He ultimately never did it, but she and I teamed up to try to sign famous people up to write books. Michael Jackson was another one, and he ultimately did write a book. But more important to me, I didn't actually work with her ever. Our relationship was more social, and I would connect. I was a good connector. For example, Calvin Klein wanted to meet the great actress Katharine Hepburn. Now, Katharine Hepburn, I had sent my first book as a gift to in the mail. And one day the phone rang and I heard something like this. "Hello, is this Mr. Plaskin?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "This is Katharine Hepburn." And I said, "No, it isn't. You're kidding." I thought it was a friend of mine playing a joke on me. Remember this legendary film actress, which a lot of people may not even remember today.
Oh, surely not.
The younger generation, if you ask them, they won't know who she is.
Really?
But she invited me to lunch.
Wow.
And I went there for lunch, and then we became very friendly. So for the next 8 years, I interviewed her like 4 or 5 times. And one day I said to her, "Would you like to meet Calvin Klein?" Because of all the famous people that he could meet, he had never met her. And she really honestly didn't care that much about meeting him, but he really cared about meeting her. So I brought him over there for lunch, and it was a fascinating time. And that was one of the funnest things about my job, is that I could meet these people, get to know them, and then introduce them to each other. So that was a memorable afternoon. And another afternoon, Peter Jennings, I brought him over for lunch with her. And I just loved her. She was so funny and sarcastic. The last time I ever saw her, she looked up at me after lunch and she said, "You look better than you used to." And I said to her, "Oh," I said, "Miss Hepburn, is that a compliment?"
Sorta.
And she said to me, "You can take it however you like."
That's great.
Which I thought was funny. So I have to tell you, I had just a ton of fun, with all these celebrities that I interviewed.
No
One of my favorites was Leona Helmsley, if you remember her.
I do.
Known as the Queen of Mean, but she was never mean to me. She and I had a unique connection. I did a cover story interview with her in Playboy magazine, and she was just absolutely riveting. One of my most favorite.
Okay, now I want to fill in a few blanks because I think you're being modest several times over. For instance, you interviewed Katharine Hepburn, and in fact, there's some footage from that in the Katharine Hepburn documentary that's streaming right now, correct?
Yes, thank you. There's a new documentary called is it called Call Me Kate?
Let's go with that. I'm not sure.
Okay, but anyway, there is a new documentary on Netflix. And yes, they came here to use me as the main journalist for the documentary because I had known her well. And I told a lot of fun stories about her. And in fact, right above my head, you can see her sitting on the wall here. That was one of the stories I did with her. And there's another article up here. There's a story that was once done about me. When I was younger, I got all D's and F's in elementary school. And the principal told my mom that she shouldn't feel bad because garbage collectors can be happy too.
Oh no!
And he told my mom I had a very low IQ, and it's true that I tested badly, and it's true that I got all D's and F's. And it wasn't until years later, I didn't have low self-esteem. I had no self-esteem. And they, you should never tell a child something so horrible. Even if they did have a low IQ, you should never tell them this. And so years later, I wrote an article that was syndicated all around the country, and it was called 88 Keys to Confidence. And there's a picture of me at the piano, and I talk about how you must never let anyone define you. And after the article was published, Katharine Hepburn wrote me a note, and it's framed right above here, and it only has 3 words on it. It says, "Good for you."
Oh,
Nice.
I love it. That's so inspirational. I mean, what a wonderful example of
Yeah.
believing in yourself and having that tenacity that you mentioned, leading to a wonderful path.
Now, you
Yes,
also
and
mentioned, go ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead, sure, go ahead, please.
Well, I was going to say, you said your relationship with Jackie Onassis was mostly casual, and yet right here I've got a quote. She said about you, Glenn is witty, articulate, and has this uncanny ability to draw people out and gain their confidence. So she clearly had some respect for your work as well.
Oh, yes, she was wonderful. She was one of my idols, and I don't know where I would ever have found the nerve to call her on the phone, but she gave me all her phone numbers. And I very rarely called her, but we did talk, and we did have wonderful lunches sometimes. And with all the pain and suffering that she experienced in her life, when she was with you, you felt as if she was only talking to you. She used to call me on the phone, and you'd hear something like, "Hello, Glenn, this is Jackie." I thought, oh my Lord. And I said, "Oh, hello, Jackie. How you doing?" But it was it was one of the few times in my life I was very intimidated. Although I must say I was intimidated by pretty much all of them at the beginning, whether I was interviewing Meryl Streep or Donald Trump or Robert De Niro or Elizabeth Taylor. I found Elizabeth Taylor was one of my most favorite. She came down the stairs of this hotel suite looking just as you would hope she would look. And the first thing I noticed about her, I said, "You have beautiful skin." And she said, "Would you like to know my secret?" And I said, "Okay." She said, "Sesame oil." She put sesame oil all over her face. So she said, "Would you like to touch it?" I put my hands on her face, and I thought, gee, I'm touching Elizabeth Taylor's face. And then she showed me a ring, this 33 karat Krupp diamond, and she took it off her finger and threw it over to me to hold. I thought this was, but then we got down to business. And by the way, there's a brand new documentary about Elizabeth Taylor that just came out. It's produced by the BBC, and I'm in this particular documentary, and it opens with Elizabeth Taylor putting her makeup on, and as a voiceover under the picture is what she said to me in the interview, which you can listen to. It's kind of interesting. But she said that if you want to hear from me, it's not going to be about how to apply lipstick. I'm going to thunder through your brain. And then she went into a whole thing about the AIDS epidemic and how she felt as if people were wrongly being blamed for something that no one should be blamed for. So it was a very emotional interview. And so this interview of mine wound up now in 2 documentaries. One is on HBO currently. It's called The Lost Tapes. And the other one is the BBC, which won't come out in the US until next year. But for me, this has just been so peculiarly surreal because who am I? Nobody. And yet I felt as if I somehow had this weird ability, maybe because they didn't view me as intimidating, although I could be quite strong in the interviews. People, for some reason, just warmed up to me, but they didn't come to me. I always went to them, and I found that it was fun for me to meet these legends that I otherwise never could have met.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, actually, because you've mentioned Meryl Streep, you've mentioned Robert De Niro, Katharine Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, and I've got on my list that you interviewed Paul Newman as well. How did you arrange interviews with these, as you call them, legends, these big major celebrities? How do you even start that process? by your own admission, you're saying, who am I? I'm nobody. And yet here you've managed to be involved in the lives of all these people. I have to know, how'd you do it?
Okay, I'll tell you. I interviewed literally hundreds of them, all famous ones, including Dolly Parton and Meryl Streep and many others. And the way I did it was a variety of ways. Oftentimes I would go directly through the publicist, but as I became more known as a celebrity interviewer, one would lead to another. For example, Calvin Klein, who knew me extremely well, picked up the phone and called Diana Ross and told her about me and said, you should do the interview with him. So I had lunch with Diana Ross. Or he called the White House and literally spoke to Mrs. Reagan. And when she came up to me, the first thing she said to me is she put out her hand. There were Secret Service people all over the place and all these people near us. And she looked right at my face and she said, you have a great friend in Calvin Klein.
Wow.
She was transmitting to me that she wouldn't have done it otherwise. And same thing with Senator Kennedy. I knew Jacqueline Kennedy. Same thing with Joan Kennedy. I got the interview through her former husband. And so oftentimes, but most of the time, it was through my own personal notes. I'm a firm believer in writing notes, sending flowers, making phone calls. I called Donald Trump and I said, I want to interview your wife at the time, which was Ivana Trump. I did 2 interviews with Ivana. Then after he left Ivana, I said, I want to do the first exclusive interview with Marla Maples. And he said to me on the phone, well, I'll make the introduction, but it's up to her. If she likes you, she'll do it. If she doesn't, she won't. So he said, we'll arrange a rendezvous for you at a restaurant with her. So I just went and met her. And I never am in any way pretentious about anything. I just come right to the point, and I often would give my books as a gift. That was another thing that people like when you give them a book. But the most important thing, I think, is that you need a heart-to-heart connection. And I was known for doing interviews that would be revealing, but not depositions.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not there to, I'm there to understand you better. I remember there was once an actor who said to me, I didn't know we were doing therapy today.
Well, it
And
sounds like you were just very good at it. It was something that you wanted to do. You stayed focused on it, and then you were very good at it.
Well, thank you. You mentioned Paul Newman, so I must give you my Paul Newman story.
Oh, please do.
I was invited up to his apartment in Manhattan for an interview at his apartment. So when I got there, it was a place on Fifth Avenue. The door opened, and there he is standing. Usually the stars have a publicist or a Mary Tyler Moore had a butler or somebody answers the door, but usually not the person. But he was just standing there with those big blue eyes. And he looked at me and he said, would you like to help me make some ice cubes? Now, I thought, well, what the hell is he talking about? I said to him, well, what do you mean? He said, well, my daughter's birthday is tonight and we're getting ready for the party and I'm filling up the trays in the kitchen. So there I stood in Paul Newman's kitchen, passing him ice cube trays. I thought that was very funny. And then I told him, listen, Mr. Newman, I have a gift for you. My grandmother has her own line of cookies at Bloomingdale's, which she did. And I said, I brought you some of her favorite meringue squares, they were called, with apricot in them. Oh, my God. He grabbed those out of my hand so fast. I said, I want you to taste it. So he opened up the box. Now, this is the guy who, make the popcorn and the salad dressing and everything. What nerve would I have to bring him some cookies? But you see, I believe all the stars like cookies or candy. So I would bring almost everybody chocolate or something. So he ate the cookie and he really liked it. And then guess who walked in the room? Joanne Woodward. She said, I'm going to Bloomingdale's now to pick up a gift. And she just kissed her husband and walked out of the room. She never even said hello to me. She was just saying goodbye to her husband. So I would often have these surreal moments with these people where it's like, it just seems so odd to me. But there I was. And then Paul Newman and I eventually sat at his kitchen table. And mostly what we talked about was his summer camp for children who have serious illnesses. It's called the Hole in the Wall Camp, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that was what the interview was about. You ask, how do I get interviews? Oftentimes I would do interviews about a cause.
Yeah.
If there was something that interested me, that's how I would get interviews with people who ordinarily wouldn't do interviews, because it wasn't about them. It was about something else.
Okay.
Good idea.
2 gaps I feel like we have to fill in here. First of all, when you got that first book contract you were talking about, and I probably shouldn't even bring this up because now some people who are aspiring to write are just going to be bitter, but you were 26, right? You were 26 years old?
I think I was 25,
Even better.
And when I got what would be equivalent to $150,000 advance in today's money, I remember I had no money.
Yeah.
I had very little. So when the agent got me the advance and sold it in the US and England, I honestly was quite nervous. Because remember, I was going to do something that I didn't know how to do exactly. I did figure it out. I did get a wonderful editor who was the editor for the New York Philharmonic and Columbia Records. And I did put together a team. But back then, yes, I was intimidated. But I always tell writers, you have to remember you're worth a lot. I believe that you have to know inside yourself that you're worth something. And, you probably know that I've written many collaboration books now, either ghostwritten or collaboration with all kinds of mostly CEOs and high net worth individuals, and some cause related books, and some doctors. And I think you just have to, as a writer, one great thing is that you could research and know about anything. It's not like you have to specialize in anything. I mean, it's true that I specialized in celebrity interviews, but then I broadened out quite a lot because I found it interesting to learn about, other things. But human psychology, inspiration, and motivation were my favorite topics. And so I liked the idea of that actualization or visualization thing we talked about earlier, because I do believe that you have to at least have a dream. Everybody's got a dream.
Should. And that other detail that I think we still haven't said aloud is the subject of this book. We're talking about Vladimir Horowitz, right? Probably certainly the most famous, probably the most accomplished pianist of the time, right?
Right. And this is what the book looks like. It's a 600-page book with 2,000 footnotes. And this is the first one that came out. But I must tell you, my favorite book of all time is this one. This is the one I wrote about my dog, in the process of getting this turned into a TV movie, hopefully. And it's not about the dog. People always misunderstand. They think, oh, that must be a cute little story about a dog. It isn't.
No,
it's about the concept of family, and that a family is anything you want it to be, young and old, human and canine. And it's about what happened over a series of years between a little 3-year-old kid who had no mom, an 85-year-old woman who had no children, and me and my dog. And it takes place before, during, and after 9/11. And it's a very emotional story about how
beautiful.
A little kid could find the grandmother that he otherwise never would have had.
Sweet. Okay, you've mentioned you're on Oprah, and you've mentioned a lot of interviews. Do you have one that stands out in memory as a particularly happy or memorable one that you haven't already told, a particularly favorite interview?
Well, I have a situation that comes to mind, but I wasn't too happy. I was interviewing Leona Helmsley, and she had it was tape recorded on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. not reel to reel, I mean a cassette tape recorder.
Mhm.
And the red light was on, it was recording, and she was absolutely fantastic. She went on for 45 minutes brilliantly. I discovered the tape recorder hadn't recorded anything.
Oh no.
It was the only
Oh.
time in my entire career that I think I had what could be called a panic attack. I started sweating, and I said to her, I have some bad news. And I explained what happened to her. Remember, she's supposedly the Queen of Maine.
Right.
You know what she said to me? She said, let's get up. Let's take a walk around the terrace, and then we'll go back in and record the whole thing all over again.
Wow.
Awesome.
Not the Queen of Mean. Okay, flip side question. Do you have any, and if you don't want to say that's fine, but any interview subjects who are particularly difficult or not forthcoming or whatever?
You know, most of the people I met, I really liked, and nobody was rude or anything, but of course they never would be. I've been thinking lately about Christopher Reeve because I interviewed him once before his accident when he, was fine, and then twice after he was paralyzed. And I only mentioned him because I thought he was so inspirational as a person.
Yes.
And imagine, taking the time to do interview with me when he couldn't walk, or, he was tragically died far too young. So he's someone that comes to mind. But if somebody said to me, was there anybody you interviewed that you didn't like? I couldn't even think of anybody, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that you talked to two of Donald Trump's wives. Did you ever interview Trump himself?
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I interviewed him more than anybody. I interviewed him for 12 hours for one Playboy interview. In fact, my interview with Donald Trump is it's on the wall behind me, and he hangs it in his office at Trump Tower. It was an interview done many years ago, but all the positions that he talks about in that interview are ones that very consistently are reflected in a lot of his positions today, especially about China and Japan and the economy and stuff. So I've known Trump since 1988 and did a number of interviews with him. And, that's all I can say. But I have known him, and, obviously he's changed as a person. When I first met him, he was really just a rich real estate, charismatic New Yorker,
Mm-hmm.
But I never dreamed that he would one day be president.
Wow.
Yeah.
When the interview is over, what is your writing process? How do you turn that interview into an article, a book, whatever the end result is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, what I always used to do is I would type the transcripts myself because I wanted to listen again. And by the way, I have all the original recorded interviews in here.
Amazing.
That's why
Great.
these documentaries call me sometimes, because even if the tape is 30 years old, believe it or not, I like Audrey Hepburn, I did this in Switzerland. I still have it. So I would listen to the tape, and I like to type it as I'm listening. And then I chunk it. Chunking for a writer is an important skill for this kind of stuff. And then I would put a subject category with an underline. It doesn't necessarily mean I'll use the material in the order they said it, but I have to know where it is. And then the hardest part for a magazine or a newspaper article is writing a lead. Like, how are we going to begin this thing? So I got to the point where when I was on deadlines, I would tell myself the first thing that comes into my mind, that's the lead. I used to be more perfectionistic about it, like, oh, what am I going to do? I decided, and this is a good tip for writers, there's no such thing as writer's block as long as you're willing to settle for mediocrity.
Love it.
In the first draft, at least, right?
In the first draft.
Get something down on paper.
Settle for whatever you can get. Just get something down. And then I didn't mean you should ultimately settle for mediocrity, but I think you have to trust some of your instincts. So I would first do the lead, and then once I got into it, it would start to flow, and somehow I would instinctively know what to put where. But there's a certain art to it, and it varies. If you're writing a book, it's different than if you're writing, a magazine article,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
Sure.
or a newspaper column. But honestly, I admire people who say, I went to the School of Journalism at such and such university. I thought, aren't you lucky? Because I learned the whole thing literally on the job. I never had anybody teach me really. So I apologize that I'm not better trained.
I think sometimes amateurs, if you use that, the root word of which is ammo, meaning love, right? So,
Well, you guys do
that's the
something
worst
that
thing.
I could never do, which is I only do nonfiction. But you do fiction. You make up stories and legal thrillers and novels. And, the closest I ever came to that is in this book. This is rather novelistic, even though it's all true. But, one thing that we have in common is you have to paint a picture. Anybody can just write some sentences. But the thing is, how could you write some sentences that would convey some emotion? I mean, what would
Right.
draw someone in where they would want to literally, they lose themselves in your world that you as novelists have created? That's a really big skill.
Yeah, well, thank you. But you know what? It's all storytelling, whether it's true or you're making it up. And when you can't make it up, meaning you've got to have sources and research, that I think is challenging too. Okay. After this fabulous, all this illustrious work, what are you working on now, or what should we be watching for next?
Well, I am in the midst of working on getting this book made into a movie, because I think it could be inspiring for people, because it has a message about family connection and loss too. Because, we live through a series of losses throughout our lives. Eventually we lose many things. And the idea of the book was to give people hope about that. I'm also working on I have 3 new books coming out. One of them is with what would you call him? A TV cable entrepreneur. He at one time owned RCN, the big cable company. And so it's kind of like a business memoir. And then I have another book coming out that is how a successful entrepreneur recovered from addiction. So it's about recovery from addiction and also about his autistic son. So it has some big themes about survival. And now there's a new one coming out with a woman executive who had a rather difficult childhood. And it seems like at a certain point in life, people want to share their stories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Glenn, this has been a real pleasure and a delight talking to you, and I hope maybe we can do it again sometime in the future.
Oh, it was great talking to both of you, and thanks for having me on your show.
No problem. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Just a few parting words. The WriterCon cruise is fairly far in the future. It's at the end of May. We're going to Alaska this year, and the WriterCon retreat is in the middle of July. But if you're interested and you cannot book too early because they tend to sell out, there's more information on our website, which is writercon.com. Let me also remind you, we've got our own newsletter. In fact, just today, as we record this, we sent out the latest issue of WriterCon magazine, but whether there's a magazine or not, the newsletter comes out regularly and it's free, and you don't want to miss it because it's got all kinds of cool stuff in it that's directed specifically for writers. So go to Substack and search for WriterCon. And if you haven't joined the WriterCon Facebook group, please do. We've got a wonderful, thriving online community, very positive, very supportive, and that's the best way to get day-to-day information about what's going on in the publishing world, okay? Until next time, keep writing, and remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit. See you next time.